Welcome everyone to another video of Just Disciple. My name's Ken and this is my co-host Brooks, and today we're going to answer the question, did God divorce Israel? This is a really interesting question, Brooks.
Right.
What's the short answer to it?
Well, the short answer is that God has always been faithful to his people, and God has never divorced his people. He's never divorced his people. Now, it gets a little more complicated than that, but if you trust us, if you think that we are infallible hosts who
Perfect,
can tell
we've
you
answered
no
it.
wrong, then you can click off the video right now. You trust it that we're telling you God did not divorce his people, period. God's always faithful, right? That's a major biblical theme.
All done, fastest video we've ever recorded.
But if you want to be like the Bereans and dig a little bit deeper into the scriptures of this, we're going to talk about exactly what that means and kind of some different viewpoints that Christians have on that. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, let's take, so there's two questions actually that we want to answer before we answer the did God divorce Israel. The first question is, who is Israel and what did the Bible mean by divorce?
Right.
So let's talk about the first one. Who is
Defining our
Israel?
terms,
Yeah, we
right.
got to define our terms a little bit.
So the Bible, when it talks about Israel in two different ways. So you see this in Romans 9. When Paul is teaching on Israel, he says, not all who descended from Israel are Israel. And that can seem a little bit confusing, right? It's like me not saying like not all Brookses are Brookses. Like that doesn't make sense, right?
You're multiple Brookses? That
But
explains
Paul
a lot.
makes a distinction, and a biblical distinction that's found frequently in the scriptures between believing Israel and the nation of Israel, right? So he says not all Israel is Israel, but he's talking about the Israel of Israel, the Israel in their hearts, the Israel of promise in Romans 9. So there's a difference between Israel, who is the remnant, is another biblical word from the Old and New Testaments, the remnant in Israel, those who actually believe in Yahweh, believe in God, and then the nation of Israel, who God has also made a covenant with. But you got to realize there's a difference between the covenant that God made with his people for salvation for all time and a covenant that God made with the nation of Israel. There's somewhat of a distinction, but we're going to get into a little bit more about what that distinction is. And then for divorce, do you want to just quickly define divorce biblically?
Yeah, so divorce was basically saying in the Bible that there was a covenant, that God made a covenant with a certain group of people or individuals. We best see this in marriage, right? Where two people come together and they say, hey, we are making a covenant saying we are committed to one another till death do us part. Nothing is going to separate us. Here we are. When you say that there's a divorce, you're saying we're breaking that covenant, we're breaking this commitment, and we are going to go our separate ways and do something different.
Right. And there are biblical reasons for divorce, right? Yeah. And there's biblical reasons for God to end his covenant as well. And we see that God, we have an end to uphold, to some extent. That's a little bit debatable exactly what that means. But
and we actually have a video on it, it's a complete separate topic on divorce and what are the different viewpoints on divorce.
Exactly. But anyway, so we're talking about that. We're going to talk about three different viewpoints about this question, did God divorce Israel? Because there's kind of three major views within Christianity. But then after that, we're going to talk about one thing that we believe unifies them all. And because there's a unifying doctrine that we think everyone would agree on, and it's the Bible's overarching emphasis when talking about this topic. So anyway, first viewpoint, the number one viewpoint that we're going to talk about is that the church and Israel are one people of God, and that God never divorced his people. God never divorced Israel. This is kind of what I believe. You look at Romans 11, Paul gives the imagery of an olive tree. An olive tree represents Israel, and when Jesus came, you see that people didn't accept him as the Messiah. Israel did not accept him. And so Paul is saying that branches fell off of the tree. Those are the unbelieving Israel, those people who did not truly believe. However, the Gentiles were branches that were picked up and grafted onto the tree. So they became part of the tree. Right, what you see there is God has one people, and at this time, all of them believing. All of them are believing people because the unbelieving branches fell off and believing Gentiles were grafted in. And so you see that the Gentiles were added to the people of God. They didn't replace Israel. They are Israel. So Israel and the church are one. This is commonly referred to as covenant theology. This is what I would most closely hold to.
Yeah, and that's the first point. The second one is what would be called replacement theology, where God actually divorces Israel. You can find this in Hosea 1. So when he divorces Israel, he breaks that covenant, and specifically talking about the nation of Israel, and says, hey, now we're going to pursue a new covenant with a new people who are going to believe and trust in Jesus, which today we would call that the church.
Right.
Right. So that is the second view. Brooks, what's the third one?
The third view is that, and you could probably better explain this one than I could, but that God does still have a relationship with Israel, but we still make a distinction between the nation of Israel and the people of God. So God still has something in store for the nation of Israel on top of all of the promises and covenants that he has with his people through salvation, right?
Yeah. And most commonly this would be known as dispensational theology.
Dispensationalism, yeah. Is kind of it's how it's played out recently, I think is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
And then talking about how the view that God divorced people, I think that divorced Israel, there's still probably some dispensational theology that would agree with that as well, for reasons such as in Hosea 1, the lo ami, not my people, you're no longer my people. Kind of sounds like God saying that Israel's no longer his people. I have to explain that. And then in Hebrews, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's Hebrews 12, where the first covenant is obsolete. He's made the old covenant obsolete. So anyway, let's get to the most important point, the thing that we want to really drive home. Do you want to introduce that?
Yeah, I think that regardless of whichever point you look at in this question, right, whether you're looking at the church and Israel are all one and the same people, whether it's God divorcing Israel or that God still has a relationship with Israel in one way, there's one major unifying theme, and that's this, that regardless of what's going on, God is always going to be faithful with his people.
Right.
And this is extremely important for us because if you think about it, we who are Gentiles, right? So regardless if we're now using that vernacular, right, where Israel, they are his people and the Gentiles are not the Israelites, we who are Gentiles and now who are a part of the church, who are believers, God is saying, hey, no matter what happens, no matter what is going on, I saved you, I redeemed you, I've transformed you, I've given you a new heart, like it says in Ezekiel chapter 32. Like all these things that he's doing, he's like, I am never going to forsake you. I'm never going to abandon you. I am going to be faithful with you.
Right. And like we mentioned earlier, there's times when the Bible teaches doctrine, and it's really important to get into even the details because they do affect a lot of things. The way you understand who Israel is and God's relationship with Israel, it has implications on your theology, on your eschatology, and on your understanding of covenants. But we need to look at what emphases the Bible places when it talks about these doctrines. All right, so we can look for the question like, did God divorce Israel? But as we're looking for that, we see an even bigger emphasis. And what is that? It's that God's faithful to his people. There's a big emphasis on God's faithfulness, God's loving kindness to his people throughout all of history and throughout all time. Has God ever abandoned his people? No. And is there anything that could ever take people away from the people of God? No. The people who truly love God, nothing can separate them from God.
Yeah.
Right? And that's true of Israel, of believing Israel, the remnant of Israel, what we said earlier, and that's true of God's people, the church now, who I would say are one people.
Yeah, and absolutely. And here's a beautiful thing, too, that regardless even of where you land on this, which viewpoint, at the end of the day, our command as people who do believe in Jesus is to bring others to saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. So whether you're like saying, hey, God still has a relationship with Israel, however that relationship looks like, they still need to come in faith in Jesus Christ to fully be in the covenant with him, to have an everlasting relationship. So at the end of the day, just realize that like as our goal is to remember that God is faithful with his people, we are also called to bring as many people to him.
Right. The big thing, no matter what you believe about this, Christians are always going to agree that salvation comes by faith, not by a commitment to a nation, right?
Yeah. Or by works.
Or by works. Like insert anything in that.
Exactly. Anything.
Salvation comes by nothing except for faith in Christ. Right. So just to talk about the faithfulness of God, I thought I'd mention as well, Romans 11, we're talking about the imagery of the olive tree. Yeah. Right. And one of the ways we see that emphasis played out in that imagery itself is that Paul talks about how we, the Gentiles who are grafted into that olive tree, have now access to the rich root that sustains the olive tree. So we've kind of been grafted into a historical, a long-lasting faithfulness of God to his people. So God's always been faithful to his people. He didn't just become faithful to us now. We're grafted into his faithfulness that he's always had. We're grafted into the people of God who God has always been committed to, always will be committed to. And God will not let go of any of us.
Man, that's so good to think about, because if you read throughout the Old Testament how much God has been faithful to his people time and time again. I'm thinking through the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, just Davidic covenant, like all these covenants that God is like, no matter how jacked up you are, I'm still going to be with you. and bringing this to a very personal level. You might be like, Ken, you don't know who I am. You don't know what I struggle with. You don't know what I'm dealing with. But like, recognize, like, no matter how messed up you are, if you put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, he will never let go of you. Like he says, like, you are my child, and I am going to make sure that he who began a good work will complete it. Philippians 1:6. So rest assured of that. So that's a very personal statement to the broader question of, did God divorce Israel? Again, short answer, no, God never divorces his people.
Yeah, so we're just encouraging you, kind of think about the faithfulness of God as you're looking through this question.
Yeah.
Think about the faithfulness of God to his people. Search the scriptures and come to what you believe God is actually saying in the Bible. We love discussing questions like this, things that are going to help us learn to love Christ more, understand God's people more, dig deeper into the scriptures. If you also love to think about questions that have you dig deeper into the scriptures, growing in your faith in Christ, hit subscribe and join us as we continue to make more videos and talk about these things. We'd also love your comments. If you have questions or you want to add to the discussion, we'd welcome it.
So check us out on Just Disciple. Hope you guys have a great day, and God bless.
Bye.